The perfect Wagnerite was to prove something of a watershed in Shaw's career. He was later to joke that it had been an artistic last will and testament. Ever the hypochondriac, he wrote it while recovering from an operation on his foot and feared he might not survive. And there's certainly an air of finality about it. As things turned out, it was to be his last substantial musical essay and mark the end of his professional life as a critic. Just as Lee had been turned into Corno di Bazzetto and Corno into the more sophisticated GBS, so too was that skin shed to reveal another, sleeker and even more lethal impersonation, the dramatist known simply as Bernard Shaw. Shaw's passion for the theatre dated back to his childhood. Still very much the second capital of empire, Dublin boasted a number of theatres of varying excellence and respectability, and the chief amongst these was the magnificent Theatre Royal, which hosted not only its own stock company, but stock scenery too, which was used, whether appropriate or not.
One in particular, with Big Ben at its centre, was quite cosmopolitan and served for all periods and place.
Not that Shaw found the company, nor the repertoire, deficient. Many a leading actor in the West End was to be compared favourably with the Theatre Royal players. A huge range of plays was available, and some of the most famous actors in the world. Sonny saw, amongst others, Salvini as Othello and Ristori as Mary Stuart, presumably playing in their own languages. He even saw Offenbach's leading lady, Hortense Schneider, when the Paris Commune forced her on the road in 1870. Given that Shaw's byword, good and bad, for all operetta was the Grand Duchess of Gerolstein, it's tempting to surmise that he saw its creator perform it at Hawkins Street when he was little more than a boy. So, Shaw's love affair with the theatre began early and was all-consuming. He was 7 years old when he was taken to see Tom Taylor's Plot and Passion, which, with its doomed lovers and poisoned lemonade, must have been a pretty uncompromising start for him.
I have no idea who acted in it, because it was all real to me. It was followed by Puss in Boots, a full-length Christmas pantomime, and in it too the fairy queen was a real fairy, and the policeman a real policeman, deliciously shot into several pieces by the clown.
Shaw was later to claim that the rich theatrical education he had received would probably not have been possible had he been brought up in London, which had already fallen prey to the complacency and second-rate dullness against which GBS the critic was to rail and revolt as a writer. The acknowledged sovereign of the London stage in the 1890s was Henry Irving, and Shaw considered him a model of self-referential laziness and ignorance. He'd seen Irving in Dublin in 1870, tempting to surmise that he was there on the same evening that one Bram Stoker was so seduced by Irving's acting that, like one of his own brides of Dracula, he swooned powerless before the actor's mesmeric force. But Shaw wasn't for swooning, and Irving's flashy stuff was knocked into a cocked hat by Barry Sullivan.
Sullivan was the stage hero of my boyhood. Of the English-speaking stars, he was incomparably the greatest. There was hardly any part sufficiently heroic for him to be natural in. An actor who possessed in an extraordinary degree imposing grace, sensitive personal dignity of style, force, self-reliance. He was also the only actor I ever saw who apologized to an audience for acting badly.
Shaw admired Sullivan for his ability to play heroes unstintingly, to give of himself unreservedly in the cause of art. He was, as far as Shaw was concerned, pretty near perfect, and the fact that his offstage life was beyond reproach only added to the glamour. Sullivan was to die in his prime, undone, said Shaw, by the strain of being superhuman 6 times a week. And that was what acting was about, being superhuman. And that's why Shaw felt drawn to the stage. By 1895, he'd added dramatic criticism to his battery. Writing for The World, he reviewed 3 or more plays a week and became as feared by practitioners and as popular with audiences as he had been as Corno di Bazzetto. He was later to admit that impartiality played no part at all in his writings. As with his assault on Covent Garden, he was a man with a mission.
What follows is not a series of judgments aimed at impartiality, but a siege laid to the theatre of the 19th century by an author who had to cut his way into it at the point of the pen and throw the defenders in the moat.
The defenders were very much an old guard who took as ancient writ the actor David Garrick's rule of theatrical management that those who lived to please must also please to live. The British drama, like English music, had been in a slow and steady decline since the mid-18th century, and it was a commonplace that between Sheridan and Shaw nothing of any note had happened. The theatres and plays were still in the hands of the upper classes. The Queen herself appointed an officer to decide what plays could be performed and which should be scrapped. But it was the new middle class that came increasingly to arbitrate on what was to be performed. They voted with their feet. If they liked the play, they came in their droves and applauded warmly. If they disliked it, they stayed away or came to mock. Pleasing the audience became everything, and it was a case of the survival of the fittest. By the 1890s, London theatre presented a bewildering array of entertainments, most of which were characterized by Shaw as having an appalling family resemblance when it came to subject matter and treatment. They were vulgar because they were prudish, prurient, and hypocritical, and nowhere was the double threat of mindlessness and titillation more abundant than in the newly burgeoning form of musical comedy.
If you will come to tea, somewhere at 2 and 3, we'll do our best for an English guest on a daisy and get free. We'll dance and sing for you on a military crew, and show you the new officer and what smart little girls can do. What smart little girls can do.
Of course we'll come inside, for none of us have tried how dance and song with the pipes who shot are effectively allied. But if you've spoken true, we'll quickly close to you. We'll sail us free and we'll take it for good little girls will do. For good little girls will do. We are sailors bright and breezy, so of course we find it easy to tease you and squeeze you in a messy Japanese.
Musical comedy?
Whatever that is.
was a curious hybrid, comedy, variety, operetta, music hall and circus, that had grown alongside the more straight-laced and unified operas of Gilbert and Sullivan. With an undemanding love plot, silly boys, pretty girls and musical numbers often by several hands, novelty was everything. Dominating the West End very much as the musical does today, the musical comedy was, in the opinion of many, what modern man had been born to rise above. Shaw always tried to avoid it, claiming that its mongrel form made it intolerable to the music critic as music and impossible to the dramatic critic as theatre. But the medium was so popular that it was impossible to ignore it entirely, and pushed to ask what he thought of the Les Mis of its day, Dorothy, which had an unprecedented 3-year run in town and another 4 on the road, he wreaked his revenge by catching it late in its run at a suburban theatre.
The pack of hounds darted in at the end of the second act, evidently in the mad hope of finding something new going on, and their depression when they discovered it was Dorothy again was pitiable. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals should interfere. If there is no law to protect men and women from Dorothy, there is at least one that can be strained to protect dogs.
A strange paradox was already beginning to arise. GBS, Fabian, Marxian, revolutionary, detested popular culture. Seeing them as the bread and circuses of the modern world, he attacked the music hall and the musical comedy for their determination to reinforce existing stereotypes and social orders, sweetening them with hummable ditties and mindless routines, but all the while keeping the lower orders in their place. Beer and smoke were thrown into the mix to numb the sense further. Grotesques replaced characters, buffoonery stood place for comedy, and in everything cheap sentiment prevailed.
I stand at your threshold sighing as the cruel hours creep by, and the time is slowly dying that once so quick did fly. Your beauty o'er my being has shed a subtle spell, and alas, there is no fleeing from the charms that you wield so well. For my heart is wildly beating as it never beat before. One word, one whisper greeting, in mercy I implore. For from daylight a hint we might borrow, and prudence might come with a light. Then why should we wait till tomorrow? You are queen of my heart tonight. From daylight a hint we might borrow, and prudence might come with a light. Then why should we wait till tomorrow? You are the queen of my heart tonight. Oh, tell me, why have you intended thus to treat my love with scorn? Such rents as will never be mended in this full heart you pour. Why did your beauty enslave me and give me such exquisite pain? Oh, say but the word that would save me and bid me hope again. For my heart is wildly beating as it never beat before. One word, one whisper greeting, in mercy I implore. For from daylight a hint we might borrow, and prudence might come with a light. Then why should we wait till tomorrow? You are queen of my heart tonight. From daylight a hint we might borrow, and prudence might come with a light. Then why should we wait till tomorrow? You are a queen
The legitimate theatre, as it was still called, was no better. Domestic dramas, cup and saucer plays as they were termed, were everywhere. In them, the good ended well, and the bad badly. Any advanced thinking or progressive behaviour was usually rewarded by a dreadful disease or a selfless suicide, while comedy trod a path worn bare by a century of writers who, eventually unable to think of anything new themselves, had gone abroad and pillaged the theatres of Europe for successes, which they then passed off as their own. There were exceptions, Gilbert, Pinero, Jones, but they belonged to the past. The fact that the audience loved them simply made Shaw more determined to change things.
I was accusing my opponents of failure because they were not doing what I wanted, whereas they were often succeeding very brilliantly in doing what they wanted themselves. And I brought everybody, authors, actors, managers, and all, to the one test. Were they coming my way, or staying in the old grooves?
Nowhere is this more clearly represented, perhaps, than in his stinging review of the importance of being earnest.
I cannot say that I greatly cared for the importance of being earnest. Unless a comedy touches me as well as amuses me, it leaves me with a sense of having wasted my evening. I go to the theatre to be moved to laughter, not to be tickled or bustled to it.
Shades of the green-eyed monster? I wonder. Shaw's relationship with Wilde was complex. Born 2 years and less than a mile apart, both were scions of the Protestant ascendancy, but there the resemblance ended. When Shaw first came to London, Oscar was already a celebrity, and the fact that his fame increased precisely while Shaw struggled must have grated. Wilde's flamboyance disturbed Shaw, who always wanted to point out how physically repulsive he had found the elder man, but nevertheless it was Shaw who prepared the petition for Wilde's release from jail, and who did much to effect his rehabilitation after the fall. But there's little doubt that anyone's success in the theatre stirred in Shaw some strange atavistic instinct to attack. He used his columns to see off any potential rivals, in which group he had no qualms about including Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, or at least Victorian Shakespeare, was pretty fair game. The texts used on the whole were bowdlerized and heavily edited to give whacking parts to leading actors, while the supporting playing was poor. Production at the time was largely in the hands of actor-managers, who presented the plays weighed down with fancy dress costumes and cumbersome sets, which required long and elaborate musical interludes to cover the many changes. GBS was quick to point out that, under such circumstances, it didn't take long for the national bard to become the national bore. He was particularly appalled at the idea that the lofty line of Shakespeare immediately announced intellectual and spiritual profundity.
As far as sonority, imagery, wit, humour, energy of imagination, power over language, and a whimsically keen eye for idiosyncrasies can make a dramatist, Shakespeare was the king of dramatists. Unfortunately, a man may have them all, and conceive high affairs of state exactly as Simon Tappertit did. If Goethe had written Julius Caesar, his conception of it would have been as superior to Shakespeare's as St. John's Gospel is to the police news.
Time and again Shaw was to attack Shakespeare on spiritual and intellectual grounds, only to celebrate the unparalleled beauty and invention of the language, and Shakespeare was hardly to blame if the audience fell for it time and again. Past masters at manipulating the senses, the Victorians put up a version of Shakespeare which Shaw found both dishonest and offensive. It was pretty, it was decorative, it was sometimes moving, but it could equally become absurd.
By operatic convention, the least appropriate of all conventions to Julius Caesar, the boy Lucius was played by Mrs. Tree, who sang Sullivan's ultra-19th century Orpheus with his lute, modulations and all, supposedly on a lyre, a feat complexly and absurdly impossible.
With his lute may he freeze on the mountain tops that freeze. Oh, themselves when he did sing. Yes, with his lute may he freeze on the mountain tops that freeze. Oh, themselves when he did sing. Oh, themselves when he did sing. To his music, lawns and flowers ever sprung, a sun and showers they had made a lasting spring. To his music, lawns and flowers ever sprung, a sun and showers they had made a lasting spring.
Just as Shakespeare was talked down, so Ibsen was praised to the skies. The Norwegian playwright had been, in Shaw's own phrase, the pre-eminent dramatist of Europe for more than 30 years, but in England his plays were regarded as indecent or boring, or both, and performances were usually restricted to occasional matinees presented by the avant-garde of the theatre world to the more progressive London intelligentsia. Shaw found these plays simply thrilling. He sang their praises in a lengthy pamphlet, the quintessence of Ibsenism, the other pillar with the perfect Wagnerite, in setting out his stall for the theatre of the future.
As a factory of thought, a prompter of conscience, an elucidator of social conduct, an armoury against despair and dullness, and a temple of the ascent of man.
Aims which set him at odds with the theatrical mainstream of his time. Up to now, Shaw had really been a journalist, and his first essays in playwriting show the journalist's interest in the day-to-day evils around him. It was typical of Shaw that he began his career with a triptych of plays about modern life which he delighted in calling Plays Unpleasant. The working title for the first, a blistering attack on slum landlordism, which he knew firsthand from his rent-collecting days in Dublin, had been Rheingold, and it's possible that, subliminally, his early works follow the Wagnerian line. Widowers' Houses, The Philanderer, and Mrs. Warren's Profession are, like the first three works of the Ring cycle, tightly and exclusively argued in terms of their central thesis, and Shaw creates a new theatrical diction for them. His fourth play he self-consciously advertised as pleasant. Tilting at militarism, nationalism, and romantic notions of love and heroism, Arms and the Man reverted to the old model of comedy, just as Götterdämmerung had reverted to the old Meyerbeerian notion of grand opera. In both cases, it's arguable that this ability or inevitability of writing in the old way was more than incidental in ensuring both Wagner and Shaw the success they craved. Arms and the Man was to set the pattern for the next 30 years of Shaw's playmaking. The themes were modern, controversial even, but the treatment was often the traditional, well-trodden path of the Victorian drama, looked at askance and with a witty distance that soon became known as Shavian. Bernard Shaw took the historical drama of Shakespeare and Schiller, the melodramas of the 19th century, and the cup and saucer comedies of Robertson and Taylor, Pinero and Barry, and reinvented them as theatre, as subversive in its form as in its content. And even when the matter was something of the greatest seriousness, which it always was, the resulting play was dazzling, light, and life-affirming.
If I make you laugh at yourself, remember that my business as a classic writer of comedies is to chasten morals with ridicule. And if I sometimes make you feel like a fool, remember that I have, by the same action, cured your folly, just as the dentist cures your toothache by pulling out the tooth. And I never do it without giving you plenty of laughing gas.
Madamina, il catalogo è questo, delle pelle che vuoi il padron mio, un catalogo che ho fatt'io. Osservate, leggete con me, osservate, leggete con me. In Italia 640, in Almania 231, 100 in Francia, in Turchia 91, ma in Spagna son già 1.300. 1.300. Ma fra questi contadini, camerieri cittadine, van contesse baronesse, marchesana, principessa e bandonna d'ogni caso, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età. In Italia 640, in Almania 231, 100 in Francia, in Turchia 91, ma in Spagna son già 1.300. Ma fra questi contadini, camerieri cittadini, van contesse, baronesse, marchesine, principessa e bandonna d'ogni grado, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età.
From his earliest years, Shaw had seen opera and drama as part of the same thing. More often than not, opera plots were lifted from plays, and Shaw repays the compliment by cross-referencing the other way. His plays abound in situations, characters, ideas and sounds derived and sometimes directly quoted from opera. Acutely aware of the sound his characters needed to make, he scored his dialogue for the appropriate voices. Early on, he spotted that operatic voices had their equivalents in the lines of business found in stock acting companies. His drama remade the old stock plays, but he wanted the Puritani Quartet to play them.
In selecting the cast, no regard should be given as to whether the actors understand the play or not, but their ages and personalities should be suitable, and their voices should not be alike. The four principals should be soprano, alto, tenor, and bass.
Different voices kept the audience on their toes. In The Apple Cart, a political comedy from the 1920s, a cabinet meeting features two women, Amanda, a music hall soprano who wins elections with comic songs, and Lysistrata, a grave lady in academic robes with a sepulchral contralto voice. Variety, contrast, and harmony were the watchwords. And the composition went further than mere vocalizing. The first St. Joan, Sybil Thorndike, remembered Shaw's first reading of the play. The lines came like music, she wrote, each character a different instrument in the orchestra, and he could play them all. Even the shape of the play was operatic.
Opera taught me to shape my plays into recitatives, arias, duets, trios, ensemble finales, and bravura pieces to display the technical accomplishments of the executants.
This wasn't just a figure of speech with him, but a genuine working method. Actors who were directed by him were given close training in the pitch, rhythm, tempo, and phrasing of the work. Shaw seized the opportunity to talk to them not about ideas and concepts, but about sounds and delivery. The word music, as he called it, was everything. GBS was immensely excited. Dramatists. Wagner's use of the medium to write political dramas through a unique, beguiling sound world was what seduced Shaw and kept him enthralled for more than 20 years. It was wholly absent for GBS from the bel canto operas, and to some extent in Verdi, though this didn't inhibit his enjoyment of them, and he was delighted to see that a new wave of Italian composers had managed a fusion of the bravura of the bel canto and, abandoning the big guitar notion of the orchestra and embracing the symphonic use of Wagner, had created something of real psychological depth and dynamism. He was particularly impressed by Puccini's Manolesco, in which he considered the domain of Italian opera had been judged by an annexation of German territory. Brought up on Massenet and Auber, the newfound depth and seamless design of the new Italian school excited him as a real possibility in the future of an opera which Wagner had left practically for dead. But his chief inspiration remained Mozart, who was, in GBS's book, as much a dramatist as Molière or Shakespeare. The opera of operas, Don Giovanni was, for Sonny, GBS and Bernard Shaw alike, the benchmark of all that was possible in drama, musical or otherwise. So much so that the greatest praise he could give King Lear was that its storm scene was as good as Mozart's supper scene.
Giovanni,
Shaw claimed he spent his life in search of a good performance of Don Giovanni. His understanding of the work, remarkable for the time, was that the music and the musical ideas sprang directly out of the dramatic situation. He saw character and action where others saw mere notes. His approach is alarmingly modern in his ability to appreciate that great works of art are modern rather than merely massive, that they are made up of 1,000 different influences, and that genius, rather than being something divinely invested, is the ability to understand, select, and reuse things in a way that is fresh and innovative. In Elvira's short A Fugil Traditor aria, he hears Handel. Handel, the master of moral ambiguity, whose female characters are often part porn star, torn between society's expectations of them and their own sexual urges. Shaw couldn't be more right. Shaw's capacity to cross-reference and intertextualize comes partly from his prodigious knowledge of music and art and literature, but also from his passion for the stage and his determination to make connections, to see the world and its thoughts and feelings as part of one entity. He believed that each generation grew more, knew more, was healthier and better educated, and more fit to take their place in society. He called the theory creative evolution, and its natural consequence would be a race of titans, artist supermen who would ultimately represent the triumph of everlasting intellect over base human passions. Bernard Shaw, the dramatist, was a busy man, and as the old century died, he wrote less and less about music, pouring himself wholeheartedly into his own word music. The music of sometimes the revolutionary Superman comes across as a fuddy-duddy who knows what he likes and prefers to keep it that way. He'd already affirmed that Wagner, in creating the artwork of the future, had in effect had the last word. Wagner's followers at Bayreuth and elsewhere were obsessed with slavish imitation, or worse still, pointless iconoclasm, and the old enemy, abstract music, was beginning to reassert itself increasingly as musicians experimented with existing rules in the hope of finding new sounds. To GBS, they were full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Impulsive, copious, difficult and pretentious. It has no distinction, no originality, no feeling for the solo instrument, nothing to rouse the attention or to occupy the memory. Whenever you hear of a great composer from Russia or Hungary, or from any other country which is far behind us in social development, the safest plan is not to believe in him.
The new nationalist schools of music excited barely disguised scorn. How could a chord be Scottish or a melody Moravian? Notes were notes, and these over-articulated outpourings of patriotism were particularly unwelcome in England, which had lived too long on borrowed music.
Wagner himself is too sentimental for us. We must have an English Wagner. Perhaps he is starving somewhere as I write.
The English Wagner was waiting in the wings and, if he was to be believed, starving true to type. Edward Elgar was a piano tuner's son, like Shaw himself, entirely self-taught. A Catholic, he was as far away from the Anglican musical hierarchy as was possible, and he was about to enter Shaw's life, the last in a royal line of composers that GBS would esteem and admit to a status approaching his own as the artist Superman. GBS had no time for English composers. Even the talented ones were musical amateurs who wrote gentlemanly music to please the establishment. Corno and GBS and Bernard Shaw were all of the opinion that the last worthwhile English music had been by Purcell. Everything else was second-rate and second-hand.
I expected nothing from any English composer, and when the excitement about Gerontius began, I said wearily, "Another Wardour Street Festival oratorio." But when I heard the variations, I sat up and said, "Phew, I knew we had got it at last."
Elgar and the Shaws, for there was a Mrs. Shaw too by now, became firm friends. Shaw made generous gifts to him on a number of occasions, and when the composer asked his alarmingly political friend for information about capital, GBS explained by proposing a financial symphony.
Allegro, impending disaster. Lento mesto, stony broke. Scherzo, light heart and empty pockets. Allegro con brio, clouds clearing.
Elgar's death in 1934 was a source of huge sadness to the Shaws. Not that it was untimely, Elgar was 70, but it was one of an ever-growing list of farewells GBS and Charlotte were forced to make, as increasingly they fell behind the march of things. Shaw's golden age as a playwright had been in the years leading up to the Great War, or the Great Catastrophe, as he termed it himself. True, he'd returned spectacularly with Heartbreak House and St. Joan, and his achievements won him a Nobel Prize in 1925. But the old world had gone, and Shaw moved uncertainly in the new one. His views on politics and society became increasingly extreme and wayward. He still wanted to play a part, but the roles he chose were increasingly ludicrous and unsympathetic. Desperate to be in the vanguard, he supported Stalin and Hitler, flirted with British fascism, and scoffed at the idea that Soviet socialism was anything other than another Eden. He denied the implications, indeed the reality, of the Nazi concentration camps, and embraced a range of fads, some relatively harmless, like the reform of the alphabet, and others, like genetic engineering and eugenics, verging on the obscene. The age of the common man had come, and there was Bernard Shaw, scoffing at it and berating it for its failure to support its apostles.